think that that passage is tipping off the whole human sacrifice thing, though, although it's an interesting interpretation. But and then the other thing is just that Abraham was wrong. You know, like at the beginning of it. Well, here we are. Let's go live. We'll come back to that. Hello, Rabbi Nancy Kasten, and welcome to our audience. Here we are, the State of Our Faith, June 28th, and we are getting ready to enter into a week where we're thinking about our country's commitment to independence and to freedom and liberty and all the things that are involved in that. And I'm thrilled to have this time to share with my partner and friend, Rabbi Nancy Kasten of Faith Commons. I'm George Mason, and we're glad you've joined us again, as you have for these past 15 weeks during COVID-19. It's been a trying time for all of us, and unfortunately, our colleague Imam Omar Suleiman is unable to join us this morning because of a death in his community that he's had to tend to pastorally this morning. And so we send our prayers and love and our sympathies to Omar and to his community at this time. Well, Nancy, here we are. We will be hearing a lot about freedom this week, and we've been experiencing a lot about freedom because of all the things going on in our country today, the issues that we've been wrestling with over what is the extent of freedom? What is the responsibility of freedom that we have? And we'll talk more about specifics, but let me just lay the groundwork here before we get started and say that freedom was, of course, a watchword for the whole point of this country to begin with. When we separated from Great Britain, we declared independence. And in that declaration of independence, we hear these words: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Are these self-evident, or do they not have to be proved over and over again? So our founding fathers came from a variety of faith perspectives. It's commonly thought, I think, that the faith perspectives that they brought were really just variations of Christianity. But I think right at the beginning, I would want us to remember that actually George Washington himself, as I was reminded this morning by a friend from Wilshire, Kyle Brown, in the Treaty of Tripoli, Nancy, said these words: the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. This was included at the insistence of Tripoli, who feared the effects of what a young U.S. could be if it were to operate under those terms. And if the Senate were to ratify such a thing, instead it ratified this treaty by unanimous vote in 1796, and it was signed by John Adams. So all this language about America being a Christian nation, clearly our founders understood that there was some Christian foundation to it because of the number of Christians that were simply participating in this process at the time. But nonetheless, there is a larger principle of liberty at stake here that transcends or that includes all of our religions. So begin to tease that out with us, Nancy. And when you reflect upon this as a Jewish rabbi representing the Jewish community in some sense, what does your faith say about all of this?
Well, I'll talk about that in just a minute, but I'm just still thinking. I decided to listen to the service at First Baptist this morning, and I would encourage everybody who's listening to our program today to go back and watch it, to hear what Pastor Jeffress was saying and to hear what Vice President Pence was saying, because I think it speaks to this idea that, freedom, the question is, what are we being freed from and what are we being freed for? And what Vice President Pence said as his sort of core theme of his speech or his sermon was that the foundation of America is freedom and the foundation of freedom is faith. And I think that, he didn't say that the foundation of freedom is Christian faith. He said the foundation of freedom is faith. So I think there's some kind of acknowledgement there that there are, different faiths but we all have this concept of freedom within our faith, and that in some ways, in every way, actually, the American conception of freedom is based on faith-based ideas from the founding fathers who came from very different Christian ideas about what freedom was.
Wait, you're saying that there's more than one form of Christianity, is what you're saying?
Well,
I'm shocked at that.
After everybody watches First Baptist this morning, they can go and watch Wilshire, another Baptist church, not even another denomination.
Right.
And,
Very true.
And maybe go over to to Preston Hollow Presbyterian and hear Matthew Ruffner preach about the chapel at Temple Emmanuel. So I think there's so many different variations. But let me talk a little bit about Jewish ideas of freedom, because, of course, we do have the underpinnings of our Abrahamic faiths in the Jewish idea of freedom. And first of all, you can't have freedom without having the opposite of freedom. So what is the opposite of freedom? In the Hebrew, the root of the word for slavery, for work, for service, and for worship is the same root. Eved, avodah, la'avod can mean to work, to serve, to be a slave. An eved is a slave. And then avodah is worship. That's the name for worship. And so when we talk about the change from service in the sacrifices, for example, in the biblical sacrifices, of course, those were transformed after the temple was destroyed into worship, to be continued on. That kind of sacrifice was a form of worship, but that's also continues to be the same root as the word for slave or servant. And we read in the Passover Haggadah a verse from the Mishnah that talks about how do we remember the ultimate redemption of the Jewish people, that were redeemed from slavery in Egypt into freedom, right? We are always going from slavery of some kind into freedom. And those definitions of slavery and freedom continue to be reimagined or re-experienced in different ways, but they're not experiences that are one and done. They're experiences that happen over and over again. And so I'm wondering if in the United States, our kind of idolatry of this idea of liberty, which seems to have become, an absence of any jurisdiction that would keep us from doing what we want to do. If that has become a distortion that has enslaved us. In other words, we can't accept we're starting to be a nation that can't accept any restrictions, even when they're good for us, because we have this idea that freedom is the ultimate, and anything that impinges on anybody's freedom has to be rejected out of hand.
So this leads into Christianity's take on this too. And I want to read you two passages from the New Testament because I think they really resonate with what you've just said. The first is from the book of Galatians. This is from Paul, and he says in chapter 5, "For you were called to freedom, brothers and sisters, only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love become slaves to one another. For the whole law is summed up in a single commandment: you shall love your neighbor as yourself." Which Hillel said something quite similar about summing up the whole law in loving your neighbor as yourself. And then the second is 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 16. "As servants or slaves of God, live as free people, yet do not use your freedom as a pretext for evil." I think this goes straight to your point, right?
Right. And I think that there are people of faith, and certainly Pastor Jeffress would be one of them, who would say, the law needs to come from God, that it is impossible to follow all of the laws of God. And so in order to be redeemed, you need to believe in Jesus, because only Jesus can actually save us from our own sins, because we can't keep ourselves from sinning. And yet at the same, and he sort of says, that's not the way Judaism or Islam works. They say, there are all these laws that you have to obey, but you can't, ultimately that's a catch-22, because you can't obey all the laws. And of course, but when we read in Isaiah 58, is this whole, sort of indication that we are responsible for one another, that the fast that God desires, that praying to God and fasting and doing all the things that we think, or even proclaiming our faith in Jesus, right, and our belief in Jesus as our Savior, that isn't going to be enough, right? That you have to release the fetters of bondage. You have to stop oppressing your workers. You have to make room for freedom for everyone else. That's part of this covenant that God has made with us. And that's part of Christian belief as well. It's not just Jewish belief, and it's played out in Islam as well in various kinds of ways.
Well, this gets to the heart of the law, too. Again, it does seem that we often take a broad brush and say, Judaism is a religion of law, Islam is a religion of law, Christianity is a religion of grace and no law. And I think that's an unfair description, even though it is true that both Judaism with halakha and Islam with Sharia are oriented toward this sort of discipline of living in a certain way. But at the same time, both Judaism and Islam are not simply trying to live according to the letter, but let the letter of the law be a spiritual impetus in personal responsibility for the community, that this is the means by which you live in freedom. And right, so this would be Christianity's point is that we were not born into a religion that was oriented toward law as Gentiles, but nonetheless, there's great pains in the New Testament to identify the way of Jesus, the walk, halakha, right, is this sort of Jesus saying, I am the way, right? So there's a sense in which it's whether we are following in this way that transforms us personally and actually participates in this work of Jesus saying, you shall love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. This sums up the law.
Yeah, but if you only retain the spirit of the law and say, okay, the details of the law, the practicalities of the law have nothing to do with my faith, and they have nothing to do with God. So so for example, you'll see if you watch this, and I'm a little obsessed right now, but at First Baptist this morning, there was a full sanctuary, which there was spacing, I assume, between groups of family members. So there was some spacing, but it was full. There were people wearing masks and people not wearing masks. There was a large choir, not social distanced. And of course, anybody who's tried to open their house of worship has had to confront the fact that choirs are the most risky part of a worship service, because when you sing, you spew your saliva much further than if you're just talking to someone. So here you have all these people so clearly, this is based on a faith that Jesus will do the saving, right? That if we have faith, we'll be okay. So what if you took that and said, okay, well, if that's the case, why do we need traffic lights? Why do we need to have an enforcement of stopping at an intersection, right? I mean, if you're not going to make people wear masks so that they can't contaminate people with a potential deadly virus, and we know that, for example, Parkland Hospital is right now dealing with the ramifications of what's happened by people not observing the social distancing that has been recommended by the medical and science communities. So why not do that with traffic? Get rid of the traffic lights, right? And we would never do that, right?
Right. So let's even take that a step further and say, many times the same people who are arguing that the government has made the right decision in permitting us to carry guns into our sanctuaries in order to protect ourselves, that we should be able to protect ourselves and that the government says that's okay. At the same time, we reject the idea that the government should say we should protect ourselves and protect our neighbors by wearing masks. Again, the logic of this is, it eludes me, actually.
Well, I think, and it also speaks to something else that I think is very serious for people of faith, right? What do we always like to quote? Everyone likes to quote, the Micah passage. What does God ask of us? To do justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with our God. Basically, this idea of freedom makes every individual like God, right? You're saying that you're letting Jesus take care of it, let's say, or God take care of it. But really what you're saying is, I'm going to take care of it based on my understanding of God. And that, to me, is idolatry, right? And that is the opposite of humility. You can't be humble and think that you are your own autonomous person whose actions don't have to take into account their influence and impact on others.
Okay, let's say this is also part of the problem of individualism in our culture and in our religion. So when God created humankind, God created them male and female. And there is a sense implicit, I think, in that text that it's not a single individual who bears the image of God, but it is people in relationship to one another, which now strikes an important note for the fact that our country was also in some ways influenced by and a product of the Enlightenment. So we have always been, in a sense, arguing for individual rights and individual liberties, and not wanting to impose any responsibility on the individual, only calling for the rights of the individual. Now, there's some rightness to that, okay? But at the same time, you end up with the wild, wild west, an anarchy, if everyone is able to do what is right in her own eyes, right, and has no sense of responsibility to neighbor. So I think it's wise for us to think, yes, we are not supposed to be slaves of another entity. So we felt as if we were slaves of Great Britain. We declared independence from Great Britain. But the challenge then in becoming a nation of our own is, are we just going to be a collection of individuals, or are we going to actually be interdependent? So, I mean, my call would be to say, in a sense, the 4th of July would best be represented by the language of Interdependence Day, not Independence Day.
Right, right, right. And but I also think that for our founding fathers, I really don't think there was any other understanding of independence, at least as an aggregate. That the message that came out was that we are going to be independent from Britain, from Great Britain, but we're not independent from each other.
That's the point.
The whole idea of a more perfect union, is that it's not a more perfect union if everyone is doing what they think is best for themselves. That's not a union at all.
Right. And then I think this takes us to where we are, not only during COVID and the question of whether you wear a mask, but also during this time when we are experiencing the protests in the streets and the renewal of our understanding of the role of police and the Black Lives Matter movement. And the question is really, do we care for all of our neighbors, or do we only want to assert our own rights here? I had a high school friend on Facebook that posted this week after the piece by Michelle Kinder that I reposted, where she was talking about, if you want to be a white ally, here are the things you have to learn. And look, this is an old friend of mine. I'm sorry?
We lost your face for a minute there. I didn't know where you went.
Oh, really? Am I back? Okay,
yes,
good.
Back.
All right, good. Well, anyway, so, he said, well, is it only one direction? Are we white people only, is it all up to us now, or do we have to do all the work, and sort of what about them? And I'm like, 400 years we've had where, isn't it time for us to focus on our responsibility, not just continue to lay the responsibility at Black Americans and say, it's your task to come to where we are, even while we hold all the power in the public square. Yeah. I mean, it's about interdependence, it's about all of us doing our part, looking out for our neighbor, and this is what true freedom will mean for us as a nation.
Well, and it can't come without reckoning, that where we have to actually acknowledge the sins of our past. I mean, Vice President Pence was bemoaning the fact that people were tearing down statues of our great heroes of the nation and that can't be tolerated. And, and then he went on to say that the freedoms that, this administration has done such a great job of protecting are freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and the freedom to bear arms. And, and you have to ask yourself, okay, those freedoms have been preserved for some people, very, very radically preserved for some people, with a very narrow understanding of what those things mean, and a limited understanding. Mm-hmm. And they've been denied to a lot of other people. So how is that freedom and justice for all?
Right. When in fact there is a tremendous energy from this administration at every turn to limit and deny freedom, say, to LGBTQ persons, in the Supreme Court's ruling on that, and over and over again, healthcare and Muslims and this sort of thing. So look, let's celebrate freedom. Let's defend freedom. Let's in fact argue for it. Let's work on it. Let's try to figure out what it means and all that sort of thing. But let's never do so when it is all about my freedom at your expense. It always has to be for each other.
My heart is very heavy on this Independence Day, because our asylum system has been decimated, completely decimated,
Right.
and
And that's about freedom.
well, our country is a nation of immigrants. We
Right.
are a nation of immigrants. We have lost that identity. We're defaulting to the identity of an American that is ridiculed throughout the world. Pretty soon we're still maintaining our position because we have so many resources of people still wanting to come here, but not they're coming here out of desperation, not because they're seeing anything enlightened or hopeful or redeeming about what our country is standing for right now. They're coming out of desperation.
Well, every 4th of July is a time of reckoning. I think about the words of Frederick Douglass, for instance. This is not my 4th of July. This is not for Black Americans a celebration of freedom and independence. In fact, I read a piece where it was 14, 17 years after Lincoln's assassination, and they erected the monument in D.C. with Lincoln there with a former African slave sort of kneeling beside him. And so that's a matter of contention right now, as you might imagine. Is this an appropriate statue? It was a matter of contention at that very time. And Douglass struggled at the dedication of that monument because he had to be honest about the mixed legacy of Lincoln himself and about the feelings of former Black slaves over the fact that Lincoln would have preserved the Union even with slavery if he could have done it that way. And so he was ambivalent about the actual rights of African slaves in America to be themselves free and their essential dignity. And so, we're always going to struggle on the 4th of July with our history and legacy. And what I would say is, let's not be preoccupied with politicizing this. Let's rededicate ourselves to the ideals of this Declaration of Independence. And let's say, all right, so we haven't always done this well. What are we doing right now?
Right. And I just find it really troubling. Today was Freedom Sunday at First Baptist Church. The vice president was there. The president was apparently watching and had tweeted about it. And that
Governor Abbott and Lieutenant Governor Patrick and Attorney General Paxton all were there.
And
what's the difference between that and Senator Cornyn? What's the difference between that and a political rally in a church? I mean, seriously, what are we using church for?
Well, and it made it very clear that these leaders have no problem applying their religious faith, their particular religious faith, to our justice system. I mean, they were crowing about the 200th conservative judge being appointed, federal judge being appointed by President Trump and being, confirmed by the Senate. And, again, if we don't, this shouldn't be political, right? It should not be political to want freedom for everyone, to want freedom of religion, freedom of religion for everyone.
Freedom of religion. First Amendment. First freedom.
But how is that going to happen? I mean, how, and I think...
Well, it's two different visions of freedom, Nancy. It's freedom to have your religion dominant and then tolerate other religions, or it's freedom of religion for everyone where no particular religion dominates.
Well, but I think, again, that's true. And I think that to have conducted a service at this time of crisis, medical pandemic crisis, in which there was considerable risk placed for people who attended, for people who had to work the event, for people who came into contact with and will come into contact with people who were there, to take that upon yourself as representatives of the faith community and representatives of the government. And then not, for example, not allow vote by mail. for people who want to avoid situations like that,
Right.
right?
Right.
How is that freedom of religion?
Well, I can't believe we've come up to the end of our time together here. And the passion of this moment and this day has been clear, and I thank you for it. It's been, I hope, a conversation that's been provocative to people, that has driven them toward consideration of how we love and care for our neighbors, not just how we claim our personal rights, whether through faith or political partisanship. But Nancy, thank you for this time together. We missed Omar today, but we've had 15 Sundays consecutively, and it's time for me to announce that this will be our last Sunday for some time, for the indefinite future, with the State of Our Faith. We had intended to do the State of Our Faith during this COVID-19 period. Actually, I think all of us thought this was not going to go on forever, and pray God it doesn't. But for now, because of some other priorities that Omar has, and because of your being gone with David for some weeks coming up for summer break, we're going to take a pause. And we don't know exactly what shape or form the State of Our Faith program will take in the future. We're going to be talking about that. And I don't think you've seen the last of us, but we're going to reinvent it. And we'll let you know on our website at faithcommons.org, on social media, and all the places you hear from us, and through our email subscription. So for all of you who've tuned in for these 15 weeks, thank you for being part of these conversations. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Omar. And
Thank
we
you,
will,
George.
well, you're very welcome. And we will see you soon, some way or another. God bless you all.